So after I give you the abstract theory, I think it'll be useful to contrast the different theories by looking at what they say about a specific issue. And so I've picked the issue of how to treat animals, how to treat the environment, that whole range of issues, because it's pretty relevant, pretty pressing, and it brings out the differences in interesting ways. So today we're going to do that with utilitarianism. We're going to talk about Peter Singer, one of the most influential current philosophers, committed utilitarian and committed animal liberation guy. So in the 70s, Peter Singer wrote this book review in the New York Review of Books, and then in 75 he turned it into a full-length book of his own called Animal Liberation. And he really kick-started a lot of the animal liberation movement in the United States and then around the world. So the fact that you can go into so many restaurants nowadays and get vegetarian dishes, a lot of that has to do because of this guy and the books and stuff that he published. And his argument is really simple. It's not going to take long. It's in 2 stages. And the conclusion is that we should care about the interests of other animals as much as about human interests. Utilitarians like to produce really clear, simple, strong arguments and then leave you to clean up the mess. So that's what he's going to do today. So the first step of his argument, he wants to establish that if we look at the reason we treat all human beings as equal, it's not because they all have the same abilities. So he has this kind of catchphrase, moral equality is not factual equality. And what he means is, we don't count people the same because they have the same abilities or the same excellence or the same level of competence. So if you think about liberation movements like women's liberation, the civil rights movement, these kind of things, Singer says, you don't want to say that the reason all people are equal is because they're all as smart as each other or whatever, right? You don't want your liberation movement to depend on those kind of facts that we can study with science that we're always getting more evidence about. You want to say, point blank, set in stone, doesn't matter what comes out of science, that we should treat all human beings' interests as equally important, right? If you're a member of this race instead of that race, doesn't matter. Your interest in happiness, your interest in not suffering should count just as much. If you're a man or if you're a woman or if you're non-binary, shouldn't matter if you're as smart or as skilled or as strong as the other person. It should still count just as much whether you suffer, whether you are happy. That's just basic utilitarianism, right? So Singer actually quotes Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, who said, the question is not, can they talk? The question is not, can they reason? The question is, can they suffer? If so, their interests count the same. That's the first point. Second point, well, if that's true within humanity, if it's true that among humans all the interests count the same, regardless of differences in abilities, then that's true of humans and other animals too. Because what could the basis for a difference be? If what matters is whether you can be happy or suffer, not abilities like intelligence, like the ability to communicate or talk, like strength, like whatever. If none of those matter to moral equality, then they don't matter just because in one case you've got a human and in another case you've got a donkey or an aardvark or whatever. there's no principled basis for saying that human interests count more than animal interests. If we're talking about the same level of pleasure, pain, happiness, suffering. So, cutting off my hand and cutting off a chimpanzee's hand probably hurts about the same for either of us, right? I mean, if you cut off my hand and you tickled the chimpanzee, that wouldn't count the same. Because one is a lot bigger deal. One is a lot more painful than the other. That counts a lot more. By the same token, though, if you tickle me and you cut off the chimp's hand, cutting off the chimpanzee's hand is going to count a lot more, because that's a much bigger deal. That hurts a lot more. So it's not that every single interest, whatever, counts the same. It's that if you're looking at the same amount of pleasure and pain between two creatures, it doesn't matter what their species is. That's not a principled basis for a difference. Just like being a man or a woman or non-binary is not relevant. Just like being of one race or another is not relevant. It's an arbitrary distinction unless it's just based on the amount of happiness and suffering involved. So Singer says, just like you have racism, just like you have sexism, you can have speciesism, which is kind of not a very easy word to say or spell, so I wrote it on the board and showed it to you. That's the second step of his argument. The first step is our interests counting the same doesn't depend on our abilities. The second step is, well, if that's true, then there's no reason to count human interests and not count animal interests just as much. So that's Peter Singer. It's a very characteristic utilitarian argument, pushing heavily for equality of interests, pushing heavily on pleasure and pain as the only thing that matters. Next week, we're going to look at Kantianism, which has a very different approach to ethics, and we'll look at Paul Taylor's sort of Kantian biocentric theory, which has a very different approach to environmental questions. So I'll see you then. Have a good weekend.